Welcome to the Archangel's Feast podcast. For this conversation, I sat down with a friend of mine who is currently living on and working with Enders Island. For those of you who don't know, Enders is a privately owned island which doubles as a retreat center and rehab center. And he's been working with some of the people in rehab. And based on conversations with him, hanging out with him, I thought it would be cool to talk about the general theme of navigating the interior life. Not really sure where it would go, but I was actually pretty happy with the way it turned out. I think we kind of came into this with two very different angles. I think for me, this theme of navigating the interior life, the idea that my faith helps me navigate this, I believe that. I think it's a true statement, but I'm not exactly sure what it means. So I was more prepared for this kind of abstract, basic conversation about that. And I think where he was coming from was a place of kind of pastoral care and talking with people and working, with the people in rehab. And he was very well read, as you can tell. And he was very much in a position to give advice and talk about all these situations we get ourselves into. But what I think it turned into was kind of me having the conversation I wanted and him having the conversation I think, he was looking forward to, both at the same time and in parallel. There were some moments where I think I was having my own conversation and he was having his own conversation, and we just kind of took turns talking. But there were plenty of touch points, and I think what it turned into was this conversation about the basics, which was also sprinkled with a lot of situational wisdom. So hopefully it'll find a way to reach you wherever you're at, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks for tuning in. All right, and we're recording. So I wanted to start with an anecdote to kind of get us warmed up, and then maybe you could react to that. I was in college, and I was taking an ethics class, and we had someone come in who had some kind of Buddhist background, and they just wanted to teach us, intro to meditation. And so they, had us kind of sit down, kind of close our eyes, and just kind of try to notice ourselves and try to notice what's going on in our head and notice what's going on in our body, and just kind of be aware. And, so we did that exercise for, 5 minutes or something. And then after that, they asked, so, what did you guys experience? What were you guys thinking about? What's going on? And most of the people there said, I was just tapping my foot. I was jittery, or someone was like, I had anxiety about, this test, blah, blah, blah. It was kind of just very, I don't know how to put it, just kind of things that were popping into their head, and just kind of realizing that. And then, but when I was doing it, I kind of let those things kind of wash over me a little bit, and I was like, well, I kind of noticed my mood, if that makes sense, where I have emotions that kind of go up and down throughout the day. I see someone I like, hey, how's it going? A burst of serotonin or whatever you get. And maybe I get my grade back on a test, and it's like, it didn't do as well as I wanted, maybe, but I went down a little bit. But overall, where's my mood at? Where am I at with life? And I kind of notice my mood, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a profound thing to say, but it was the most profound thing that was said. Like, everyone was noticing where they were at on the spike. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm worried about a test I'm going to take next, in the next class. Mm-hmm. Or my foot's jittery, or like they're just kind of making those observations. And I was the only one who kind of like distinguished between that and my overall place where I'm at in life. And I don't know, I was the only one that made that distinction. And I don't know, I'm not saying other people are incapable of that. But I do think there's something to be said that Catholics are just kind of, there's a mindfulness, whereas we're praying, we're trying, and we're focusing on our prayer life, and we're focusing on our mood. Like, prayer was just hard today, or I just wasn't in the mood, or I got a lot out of Mass today. I just felt great, like I was connecting with something there. And I think people or Catholics, I think we are in the habit of noticing our emotions, at least in our prayer life, for example, or we're noticing how a song made us feel, or we're noticing our feelings, and then we're putting it in the context of, you know, our kind of life trajectory at the moment. And I think we practice doing that, you know. Maybe that's kind of an intro to this theme of the interior life here. But is that, I don't know if you have any reactions to that, where...
Yeah, I think that, well, I think a lot of things. I mean, I think that, I think a lot of things, but I mean, about what you said is, but I think that, like, you know, I think as Catholics, we're sort of raised, you know, obviously around the sacraments and around kind of rote prayer and devotions, Stations of the Cross, the Rosary, and so on. Even, you know, priests and religious make a promise to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, you know, which is prayers out of a book. And all those things are good and important and part of our tradition, but I think that sometimes I think that we're not taught about that next step kind of prayer, that more contemplative prayer, that, because that's where the real movements of the interior life, I think, happen, is in there, you know. And I think that it's a delicate, and the spiritual tradition of the church would tell us that it's sort of a delicate and interesting balance, and between things like emotions and things. There's got to be more than emotions, right? But by the same token, emotions are a part of it, and mindfulness is an essential part of it. And then you look at something like the Mass and our participation in the Mass, which strictly speaking should be about what we put into it, not what we get out of it. But so often we sort of make an evaluation based on what we get out of it, what emotions we are feeling when we leave there.
Yeah.
And so, like,
maybe another way of putting that is you're trying to orient your life in a certain way, and you're hoping maybe that your emotions align with those higher goals.
Yeah, or like just sort of that. I think sometimes we make a judgment about our experience of liturgy based on that emotional response, you know, and there's more than that, because it's, I think that the more that we grow kind of in that interior life, the more our perspective on things like the Mass, devotional prayer, that kind of thing, changes a little bit and takes on a new depth.
Actually, maybe to draw a sharp line in the sand on one of the points you made, where I know a friend of mine, who really goes to Mass out of a pure sense of obligation, where he's very, he has a hard time focusing, and it's just very dry for him, and it's tedious, and he's very, his brain is just zipping around everywhere, and it's just, it's pure discipline, you know, and for him, you know, there's kind of a struggle to align his will to do what he's supposed to do, and kind of corralling his emotions, you know. But kind of, I think to your broader point, yeah, there's a certain way we want to live. Like there's a certain lifestyle, is the pursuit of a relationship with God, and then, you know, I don't want to say corralling your emotions, because you hope that your emotions align with all that. Like if I'm married to someone, I don't want it to be just out of obligation that I'm faithful, right? I want my emotions to kind of be aligned with that. And that's kind of, maybe that's a very personalized adventure that someone would have, their personalized journey. But
well, yeah, and I think that the Mass, you know, the ancient Jews, when they went to the temple and they brought their lamb, you know, for the sacrifice, they had cared for that lamb since they got it. Like they would procure the lamb and then take care of it, make sure it remained unblemished, make sure that it met all the ritual requirements. And then they would bring it, the lamb would be slain, and then the blood poured on the altar, right? Which would be sort of the completion of the sacrifice, after it passed through the ceremonial hands of all the priests and so on. So you think about it, we, you know, during the Liturgy of the Eucharist, you know, kind of that whole moment, you know, the lamb is sacrificed, or made present at the sacrifice of the lamb, right?
Mm.
And how do we care for that lamb during the week? You know, what do we? Because for the Jews, they develop some kind of attachment to this lamb. So like, what do we do with the lamb during the rest of the week? You know what I mean? And I think that, for that matter, when we go up and receive communion and we say Amen, you know, John Paul II compares that Amen to Mary's yes to the angel Gabriel, and how that Amen should be a life-changing moment. That it should be definitive or decisive. He used the word decisive. That's a decisive yes to what God has in store for us, and in continuing with that theme of relationship, you know, a relationship of love is one of a mutual exchange of gift, the gift of self, right, wholly and completely. And so He gives, you know, the Lord gives Himself wholly and completely to us, and we give ourselves wholly and completely to Him, and all of that is what's encapsulated in that Amen.
Mm.
And for all of that to work and be meaningful, that requires an interior life all the rest of the week, right?
Yeah.
And so that our experience of the Mass then becomes not so much a matter of obligation and not so much a matter of just ceremony or just liturgy, that it's a vital piece instead of this ongoing relationship. That's really a relationship of love and that mutual gift of self between us and Him.
Yeah. Maybe not to get caught up in the language of emotions here, but it's almost like there's so much underneath our emotions, where emotions are kind of almost surface level reactions to things, and they might be reacting to something legitimate, or they might be off doing, who knows what they're off doing. But there's something about, you know, having that disciplined life and that pursuit of a relationship with God and the discipline required to do that. I think just kind of jumping into this conversation, I'm realizing, like, how do we characterize that? Like, what beyond our emotions is going on under the hood? Like, it's like, what's this, you know, if I say, you know, the Catholic Church helps me navigate my interior life, I say that and I believe that and I know it to be true, but it's almost like, what does it mean? Like, what's the scope of the interior life? Like, there's something about this that really almost addles my physics brain, because I got a physics degree, and we think in terms of upside down pyramids, if that makes sense. Or at the bottom, you know, there's, at the bottom of all things, there's maybe particles that obey a few equations, and then you combine them into atoms. The atoms there's more kinds of atoms, like there's more equations that are going to describe a bigger variety of behavior, and then those are built up into, you know, molecules and organisms and organ systems, and you get really complex behavior at the organism level, and it's like these simple elements combine, and that combination of the elements turns into complexity. And there's the idea is there's a few basic principles at the bottom that kind of really govern things. And I think for me, when it comes to navigating the interior life, I think it's hard to see what's at the bottom. Or I think a lot of times Catholics will, the language I hear is, you know, it's about, it's loving God, it's a relationship with God, it's developing trust in Him. And it's not clear to me if that's like just the bottom, the tip of the bottom of the pyramid. That's the core, that's the bottom. But then there's elements in the middle that combine in complicated ways. So, for example, like if I'm in a situation where prayer is very dry, you know, well, that's my emotions, those are coming into play. And I have to, you know, if I'm going to navigate that, I have to trust that there's some meaning to where I'm at. And it's like, it's because I'm in a certain place and I'm maybe called to something else, or to respond in a certain way, or to change my perspective on things, or maybe just to develop patience and discipline. I don't know, but finding purpose in that. And it's like, there's things here that are interacting with each other that are combining and giving rise to this appearance of complexity.
Mm.
Or it's like if I'm in a no situation, if you're in a situation that you don't know how to get out of, it's by definition it's complicated. Like how do I navigate the spiritual life? It's complicated. But I say it's complicated because that's how it appears to me. But what I'm hearing from my my Catholic friends, it's you gotta trust in God. It's a relationship with God. Very simple things, but at the same time, I feel like I'm in a complicated situation. So for my physics brain, there must be stuff in the middle that we don't understand, if that makes sense. The elements of who I am are combining in complicated ways.
Well, I think that there's, you think about it from just this weekend, I led a retreat for 50-something guys in recovery from alcoholism, and we talked about the theme for the weekend was prayer as relationship, and the example is the vast majority of them are married, and so I kept kind of going back to the example of the married couple, and I think that when you think about a married couple who's been married for 50-something years, right? When they first met, that was all driven by attraction, right? There was some kind of an attraction. They probably, well, she's pretty or he's handsome, whatever, right? And then it sort of starts to grow, and you get to know one another, and you get to go through that whole experience. And then, yes, and then marriage comes, and then, and life takes over, and those emotions change through the years. Like the couple who's been together for whatever, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm celibate, so I don't know. But say they've been together for 5 years. I don't know. I remember a priest when I was in the seminary. I remember a priest saying once to a married couple, "Are you going to continue to?" The vows can be summed up by saying, "Are you going to stay together even after you fall out of love with her?" And I thought, "Oh, that's rough words.
Yeah.
You're not a romantic, are you, Father?" But then in the conversation after the wedding, we was talking about how that starry-eyed, very romantic notion of love. Yeah, it's gonna fade. He's gonna gain weight. She's gonna gain weight. They're gonna get old. They're gonna go through life's trials and tribulations and turmoils, but the love that binds them together in marriage is a love that is more than just a surface romantic sense of love, right? It's that deeper sense of love, of a total and complete gift of self to one another, where they really give themselves as gift to one another, and that love takes on a much deeper meaning. So there'll be points along the way where, when they look at each other, it's not with the same wow as in the beginning, or as that that day when he realized that he was in love with her or whatever. But they remain in love, that love is now beyond sort of those emotions. And I think in the relationship with God, it's the same kind of thing, right? That's what we talk about, the dark night of the soul and the experience of the mystics, and sort of the foundation that's under that is the realization that this relationship now has moved beyond just these emotions, and we've now moved into that point where we've given ourselves as that total gift of self, and we've come to more fully understand what it means for him to have done that for us, and that so now we move into this depth, so that in those moments where it seems like God might not be there, or we're not experiencing consolations, or we're experiencing all desolation, or where prayer is dry, that kind of a thing, we're beyond the romantic notions of love with God, and now it's deeper.
Yeah.
And so I think the trick to navigating the interior life is how do we sort of move from point A to that point where that relationship has gotten deep enough and bound together enough where it can weather those storms, and where it can kind of move into that depth.
Well, it's also the process of recognizing where you at and recognizing where you're going to want to be and then recognizing what steps you have to get there, and then taking those steps. And that's a whole process. And I actually, now what you were saying about relationships, maybe to kind of riff off that a little bit, because I was in a relationship, for a year and a half, which ended several months ago, and it was interesting because I think one of the hardest things actually wasn't. It was kind of the uncoupling of our lives. I think that was the trickiest thing, where it wasn't like navigating the emotions of, I like this person, I'm not seeing them much anymore, and just navigating the kind of emotions was a lot easier. And then the harder thing was kind of the uncoupling of our lives, because we started, knowing each other's families and really supporting each other in different ways, and it was good. And I think that was the harder thing. So kind of riffing off that idea, where this has something to do with the notion of self. It also has something to do with the notion of coupling your life to the church, to God. It has something to do with your identity, and then acting out on that and deepening that sense of identity.
Yeah, because in the course of that, as you move towards that experience of sort of coupling, that sort of happens in tandem with the relationship growing deeper, right? And and sort of what's that marked by? Really, I think that we would say it's marked by moving into deeper in trust, right? Which happens through vulnerability, making yourself vulnerable to one another, and as all of that's what that growing deeper and deeper is, so that all the other coupling can happen. In terms of the more material coupling, shall we say, sort of reflects the interior coupling that's happening as you're growing deeper and deeper in intimacy, not necessarily physical intimacy, but intimacy in terms of that growth and trust, by sharing in vulnerability. That's really how it happens, right? And we have to do the same thing with God, in that our relationship with God, as it grows in trust and in vulnerability, and our willingness to become vulnerable before Him, and more and more our lives become coupled with His, or we become coupled just with Him.
Actually, I think now that we're talking about this, it's the nature of the coupling seems to be the long-term plays rather than the short-term plays. So if my goal with God was to say my prayers today, and that was my whole spiritual goal, was get through today. It's like I could, I'll go to church, I'll pray 5 rosaries today, but then I don't have, if today was the only day that mattered, I could do anything today. But trying to sustain that over the course of my life, that's a totally different animal. Like, navigating today is a very different animal from navigating potentially the rest of my life. To make an analogy here with like fitness, where if I've heard personal trainers talk about diets, it's like the best diet is the one you can stick with. Because I think a lot of people get their New Year's resolution and they go crazy for a day, but that's not sustainable. And so it's the whole art of setting achievable goals and achieving them for the purpose of the long term, that long-term coupling. And so if someone is worried about, let's say, their emotions in their prayer life, let's say prayer is dead for me, it's just, I'm just not feeling it. Like, the concern really isn't about today, right? And I think that's why people are going to pay attention to their emotions when they pray, because if I can muscle through any prayer today, but if that's going to be the rest of my life, that's a different story. I don't want that to be the rest of my life, and that's why I wrestle with it, because that's not how I want my life to be. I was this reminds me, I was reading the diary of Saint Therese and Faustina, diary of Saint Faustina, and I got halfway through and I couldn't quite finish it, And the reason was it seemed like just a roller coaster of consolation and desolation. And it didn't, like, I didn't see where it was going. And maybe that was just me not putting pieces together. I don't know. Maybe it was, I don't know, I was in college. Maybe it was where I was at. I don't know. But it seemed like if that was me, I that's not a sustainable spirituality for me. And that's what turned me off. Like I couldn't do this my whole life. And she was just, that was her life. You know, she was in a convent, kind of, I don't want to say in her head, but it's just a very interior, she was living a very interior life in a convent. Like, just, and
I think that the, you know, the diet, I think you're right. New Year's Eve, you know, that New Year's Day, like, push, you know, it's like, well, because people New Year's, they're like, oh, I'm going to quit smoking, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to start going to the gym, I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to eat right, and I'm starting all of that today. Yeah. So they have like a miserable January 1st, plus they're hungover from the night before. Yeah. So like, you know, they tarry through, and then January 2nd, maybe they do pretty good, and by the 3rd, it's all come undone, right? Yeah. And then the gym is back to normal. But I think that when you look at a relationship, like I look at my parents. My parents were married in 1963. They're still married today, and in many ways, my sister just posted on Facebook on their wedding anniversary, posted a picture of the two of them kissing, like on their wedding day. And then a picture of them kissing like a month ago. And my sister put, still kissing, 50 something years later. And of course everybody was like, oh, how cute, oh, how cute. Yeah. And, the reality of it is though, is that they're, although yes, their love has grown to a particular depth, and they've been through a lot. They've been through loss. They just, even as recently as this year, their house burned to the ground. And they just soldiered right through it, Wow. And But they're still like, exchanging these little kisses like they did in the beginning. And I share that because I think that to a certain degree, it's been 50 something years of today's, that realistically speaking, we tell the guys here at the island, the recovery community, that it's a day at a time. Everybody's got 24 hours. We talk about sobriety. Everybody's got 24 hours of sobriety. Just after a while, you get 365 of them, but really what we have is today. And I think that, I think that in our sort of contemporary day, in a world of dating apps and dating websites and all this, the dating world has taken on this sort of mentality about like really planning, this is what I'm looking for in a significant other, and we type up a profile and a system matches us, and then you start dating and you're sort of thinking about the future. Well, is this the person who I want to, is this heading in this direction? I think a lot of it happens up here instead of in here. Where in 1963, when my parents got married, or in 1960 when they met, or whatever year it was, I think that they went more from a perspective of today. And this is today. Before you knew it, they had a whole bunch of todays. And over the course of all of those todays, the love between them had grown deeper and deeper and deeper. And so now they talk about getting married. All right, they get married. And it continues to, I don't think that it's sort of something that they chart out. I think it's something that happens. Does that make sense? And so I think in the relationship with God, because we can only encounter God in today. Because God lives in an eternal now, right? And we're the ones who live within history. And so the past is the past. And if anything, Satan torments us about our past. And the future is yet to come. So we can only really truly encounter God today, in the present. Mm-hmm. So God who lives in the eternal now, and we encounter him in our now. And so in today is where we encounter God. And so really today is all we can deal with. And so if with each today we give it the best go in just working in that within that relationship, then it's going to develop just as naturally as my parents back in the 60s. And so I think that similar to my parents, what did they do? They just spent time together, you know? And I think that that's really all we really have to do is just spend time together. Just spend time with him. And the more, I was telling the guys on the retreat, you know, the more dynamic and the more intimate a relationship is, the more dynamic the communicating is, right? Like, we all have those relationships in our lives that are purely social media based, right?
Yeah, sure.
And, you know, you communicate by likes and shares. And then you have the people that you text with, and that's really kind of all you do. Just kind of text with them. Maybe the friend from college that you loosely keep in touch with, you know. And then you have the people you hang out with once in a while and you text with. And then, but you have that significant other who, there's so many different forms of communicating that are essential to that relationship. Like I said to the guys on the retreat this weekend, like if you only texted your wife and never sat down for a meal with her, like, that sounds absurd, right? I said, and try to go a day without texting or see how that goes over. I said, well, I'm going to see you at dinner. Why did I have to talk to you at all during the day? No, like, we talk to each other, right? Yeah. You make decisions based on, you know, if one of the guys at work say, oh, you want to go out for dinner tonight? Like, if you're in a relationship and there's someone back home, like, you make that decision about going out for dinner, you take that person into account. Well, maybe they've already cooked, maybe they've already, you know. Similarly, I think in our relationship with God, the deeper it gets, the more we're taking that relationship into account when we're making decisions, when we're kind of, you know. So I think that when someone sets out on the journey of the spiritual life, I think that it's very much about thinking, especially, you know, when folks are real serious about it, they're thinking about kind of like from a systemic point of view, like, what's the plan here? What am I going to, you know, what are the steps? How am I going to do this? I'm going to reach that goal. And that's great. But I think that the steps really is just simply a day at a time. And just immersing yourself in that relationship with that person who is Christ, and to let it grow like any other relationship does. And so it's one of those things where, you know, after a year, you look back at where you were spiritually a year ago, and somehow it's not the same. And all you've been doing is spending time with him each day.
Sure.
And this thing has grown deeper and deeper.
Yeah. Well, so the church has a lot of paradoxes. We believe in justice and mercy, and I think you articulated one side of a paradox, which is, you know, take it one day at a time. So let me try and make a case for the plan here, the planners. So my question for you might be, how would you, if you're going to take it one day at a time, how do you reconcile that with the whole concept of movement and the whole concept of, look, I still do want to somehow improve my spirituality. I want to, like, if there's deep hurt from my past or something, I want to heal from that and I want to move forward. Or if, you know, I keep saying prayer life is dead, but, you know, that maybe that's something someone's struggling with. Or maybe someone's caught up in habitual sin. It's like you want to move out of that. You want to move, like, movement is a big part, and you want to have a sense of where you want to move in the direction too, don't you? And forgot where I was going with that. But
well, I think that the interesting thing is that the notion of, and I get what you're saying, and I agree with you. However, that would sort of presuppose that prayer, that we're the ones controlling it. So I have to have a plan when I go into pray. I often say to people, there's no such thing as distractions in prayer. So, you know, I sit down and pray, and my sister-in-law keeps popping into my head, you know, and I'm trying to pay attention to prayer. Maybe the good Lord's trying to tell you that your sister-in-law needs some prayers. Or maybe, you know what I mean? I think that if prayer is relationship with God, who initiated that? God did, when he called us into existence. you know, and he's always in relationship to us. It's sort of like that electrical socket. You know, there's always power flowing in that electrical socket. It doesn't magically start flowing when you plug something into it. There's always power there, and once in a while we plug into it, and then the light comes on or the radio comes on, whatever. So God is always in relationship with us, always, whole hog, and we just plug into it sometimes. And so really, as that relationship grows, he already knows what all of our wants are. He knows what our needs are. He knows what our desires are because he's planted them there. So I think that prayer is less about, well, God, I want to do this or that, or help me with this or that. And it's more about a disposition of openness and going where he leads us.
Yeah. So this is cool because now all of the analogies we were making just break down. So like at the gym, for example, like just to make this point here, so John was, I got John into lifting for about a week. Mm-hmm. And he was like super into it. He was ready to just hit the gym because it's something I've been doing for the past few years, and he saw what I was getting out of it. And he's like, I'm gonna start doing this now. And so he kind of followed my recommendations, and he pushed himself a little too hard for the first few days, and then he ended up like throwing out his back while drinking water. So there's something about going to the gym, just to highlight the point where the analogy breaks down, just for the sake of the conversation, where when you're going to the gym, you're dealing sort of with a finite resource, which is like your time. Or if you're talking about work or any other skill you're developing, it's like you're investing your time and you're trying to, optimize the development of this skill or this income or some variable you're trying to optimize here. And then that's kind of where I was coming from when I was saying you want to play the long game. Like when it comes to investing money, you want to play the long game. When it comes to your health, play the long game. Mm-hmm. And it's not so much worry about today, but it's not, what you were kind of saying is, this is where the analogies break down, where God is not a finite resource that we have to optimize for. Mm-hmm. God is something like a relationship with God is a state of being that's always, it's meant to be our identity, and it's always available to us. Mm-hmm. Like I think the power and the voltage in the outlet there is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Was it's something that's always available to us. We just got to plug into it, mm-hmm. which is, it's different. It's not like a finite resource that I got. It's not a variable that I'm trying to optimize. It's not like strength or cardio or income or some variable I got to optimize and devote a finite resource of time to. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a totally different kind of thing entirely, or it's like it's, again, going back to your identity. I'm not, so if it's its own thing, maybe it's not its own thing. It's like a relationship, and I think that's maybe really the only analog where being married is my status. It's like a permanent status. It's who I am. I'm mm-hmm. always plugged in. Mm-hmm. It's not something like a finite resource that I put time into. It's who I am in a mm-hmm. sense. It's more connected with my identity. And so the way you have to navigate that is different from the gym. Mm-hmm. And I think which is really interesting because, a lot of people are here and, giving a talk or something, they're going to make a lot of analogies to the gym. When they're talking about prayer life or spirituality, there's a lot of, the gym keeps coming up.
Because I think there's a lot of I think it's kind of the low-hanging fruit in a way.
Discipline, having a disciplined life.
Yeah, because
it's a tool that serves.
Yeah, it involves discipline, and it involves sort of, the notion of, you got to suffer a little bit to get the gains, and these, and all those sort of, and that really is low hanging fruit, mm-hmm. because that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, it is relationship, mm-hmm. and I think that we still have goals in that relationship. My goal in that relationship is eternity with him, right? That's the goal. It's the only one that matters.
Okay.
And
sounds like the long game.
what's that? Yeah. Like, that's the goal in this relationship. But in terms of how that relationship is going to grow, that's really in his hands. And I just got to keep showing up. And I just got to keep putting time in. And the more I let him take over, the more that it's going to grow. You know?
Yeah.
And Teresa Lisieux writes in her book about, she compares sort of holiness to these different sized glasses. And she'll say, like, that if you have sort of a big cup and a medium cup and a small cup, and you fill them all with water, that this takes a different amount of water, but once they're full, they're full. And she's kind of saying that, God, you have the great saints and you have the everyday folk, but at the end of the day, if we all make it to heaven, we're all saints. The glasses are all full. And then he calls all of us to sort of to live the gospel and to achieve different points or different levels, I guess, in this sort of development of the interior life.
Yeah.
And as long as we're always there, we're always showing up to that relationship and present to that relationship, it's going to grow deeper and deeper. And it's one of those things that we recognize in hindsight, like, whoa, a year ago I wasn't here, much like I think in a romantic relationship. My parents, I'm sure, in 1974, if they took a minute and looked back to day one, they'd say to themselves, wow, we're in a different place than we were. If this had happened, if this crisis had happened 10 years ago, I don't know that we would have handled it the same way,
Yeah. Maybe to help close the loop, maybe I'll try and put a little bit of pressure on this point one more time, which is, so is there really a difference then in your mind between playing, let's say, the short game versus the long game, which is, because the way I'm thinking about this in my head is, if I had one day, if today was the only day that mattered, I feel like I would fill up the day with, quote, spiritual activities, if that makes sense, where I would try and fit in a holy hour, a mass, and a rosary, or 5 rosaries, or I'll hit all the mysteries. But it seems like I would, if I had one day, I would busy myself with spiritual activities. But there's a kind of, I don't want to say burnout. Like, I can't do that every day for the rest of my life. Like, there would be some kind of burnout. But there's, maybe the answer is there a difference between spiritual activities and a state of relationship?
Oh, yeah.
Is that ringing a bell?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
it's sort of like the old saying, that you could be, there's been a lot of popular debate about the difference between spirituality and religion. I think that for a while we saw the birth of this notion of people saying I'm spiritual but not religious, and there was like big debates about what that meant and if that was a thing. And then Pope Francis sort of said something about being spiritual, or people being spiritual and not religious. But at the end of the day, there really is a difference between, we can do religious things. You can say the rosary, we can do all kinds of religious things. But that doesn't mean that we have a relationship with God at all. It doesn't even mean that we're a decent person outside of those acts. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, look at not for anything, but like, look at what's happened in the news of priests with the kids and cardinals and moving them and all this other stuff. Like, and part of the horror of all of this is that, well, how can Father be, well, one of the many, the whole thing is horrifying, but one of the parts of that is like, people just know, finally we hear, oh, I'm shocked, his Father so-and-so, he was such a holy man. Well, what do you really know about Father so-and-so? That he shows up and says Mass. He answers the phone when you call the rectory, he buries the dead, he baptizes the babies, he does the weddings, he does all these religious things. But we don't know anything about his interior life,
Yeah.
So, I think that absolutely, there's absolutely a difference between relationship and doing religious things, totally a difference. And so, I know, typically before I go to bed at night, I do a little walk around the property and I do a rosary. And I intentionally do it at that time because I find that I can really kind of immerse myself in the rosary. Where, like, if I listen to the rosary, like one of those, on an app or something like that, I don't really, my mind wanders, and before I know it, I'm on the 4th decade, and I'm like, oh, cool, said a rosary.
Yeah.
But that's why we tell people that, they should come to Mass to get to Mass a little bit early so they can immerse themselves and make themselves present in the moment before Mass begins so that they can really be present for Mass. As opposed to if you race in and, quick genuflection and dive into the pew because the crossbearer is right behind you, coming in with the procession.
Yeah.
And you blow through Mass and you blow out again. So, and the realities of life happen. So, if all we have is all these religious acts, then they're only as meaningful as those acts. But if there's relationship, then, if there's a day where you happen to not say the rosary, it doesn't kill this relationship. You have this relationship still, and then religious acts take on new meaning. So now when you have a relationship and you sit and do the rosary, and when you view prayer as relationship, now the rosary takes on a whole new meaning. And when you're doing these things, they're much more than religious acts. They're expressions of this beautiful relationship of love. And if you don't do one of those religious acts, it's not the end of the world, because you have this relationship. Sort of like, well, gee, honey, I'm not going to be able to go to the movies with you tonight. All right, it's not the end of the world. We're not breaking up over it, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's definitely a difference between, and so I think they like to look at, in terms of the idea of burnout, I think it's I really think that it's just like the experience of courting. The more in love we fall with Jesus, the more time we want to spend with him. And we make time for what's important to us. And so you're not going to burn out because it's happening very naturally. And because he's always going to provide the wiggle room that we need to do the things we need to do. And when it's relationship, we're always in that relationship. Even when we got to do homework, we got to go to class, we got to go to work, we have things we have to do. We're still in that relationship.
Yeah. So maybe this kind of meshes your concept of take today and do today, but also seeing it evolve over the long run in a sort of progression that you could look at retrospectively, which is just, what do I got to do today to plug in? To invite God into the moment and to just be with him in that sense, or to just to plug in. If I'm at work, just thinking about it, if you have a moment at work and it's like, oh, what do I got to do to plug in right now? Or if I'm just driving in the car or having a chat with friends, it's like, what if I just took a second, just plugged in? How would that breathe a different kind of life into my life? A different kind of breath and fresh air into my moment.
You know what I do? I have a journal, and each day has a page, and at the top of the page, I bought one of those. It's a predated. The book has 365 pages, and it's predated at the top. So what's today? The 4th, 5th, third.
Yeah.
So the top, the corner says November 3rd. It was pre-printed there, and across the top of the page I just make a note of all the things that I need to do to plug in.
Yeah.
Some of it are things that I've promised to do, like Liturgy of the Hours. So I'll put and I do this every night before I go to bed. I mark them for the next day. We do, the Liturgy of the Hours, the Rosary, Holy Hour, in the examine a couple of times. And then like below that, as the day, every time I go to plug in during the day, I grab the journal and I put little check marks. Because that helps me make sure that I do my little plugins. And then towards the bottom of that page, underneath that, I keep, I'm sure you're familiar with the examine. You take note of the things of your gratitude. So I make note of the things I'm thankful for. I make note of the people I promise to pray for. And at the bottom, I put reflection. And I'll just put a couple of tweet journaling, I call it. I just put a couple of lines of sort of the fruit of my prayer during the course of the day. And I find that for me, by doing that, it helps me stay grounded in my plugins, and making sure I get my plugins done. And it keeps a sense of prayerfulness throughout the course of the day. And then when I go to sit and do serious prayer, like I'm going to go to adoration for an hour, or, I find it much easier to kind of get into that headspace, because I'm kind of, especially by doing something like the examine a couple of times a day, like that really, I think, helps. That's like the texting with your wife, because like you're checking in, the examine shouldn't take an hour, 2 hours, it should take like 10 minutes. And it's just kind of just checking in, and it helps them keeping your head straight, and it helps keep sort of that sense of prayerfulness. And then if you're kind of like making note of things in like a journal, then when I go and sit and do adoration, I can look at the things I've made note of and go a little deeper into those things, And it's in that deeper prayer where we find some of the answers to some of the questions, and where we work on things like some of those deeper issues we were talking about earlier, and it's through things like the examine mixed with that deeper prayer that we're able to do things like deal with sinful habits that we're trying to break ourselves of, or that we're able to deal with discover trends and say, oh, okay, well, this is where that behavior might come from. So that's what I need to address, and that's what I need to work on. And we sort of, but all of these things that magic notebook is a day at a time. All I can work on is this page, today's page. As the gospel, Jesus says in the gospel, it's about the parable about the man who wants to build the barns and fill his barns. It's one of my favorite gospels, because I think Jesus is very funny, and I think we often miss it. But he's, the man's going to build all these barns, and he's, I know what I'll do. I'll fill all these barns with the surplus, and then I'll eat, drink, and be merry. And then God says to the man, you fool, your life will be demanded of you tonight. And I think that parable is funny for a couple of reasons. First of all, in most parables, God doesn't speak directly to the person, but in that one he does. And God's kind of funny, because you fool. I think it's funny. Yeah. And really kind of, I think that really is such an important point that God himself had to say it in the parable, Like, your life could be demanded of you this night. And that's true, right? Tomorrow's not a sure thing for any of us. So if we build our relationship, if our relationship with God is built on a long-term plan, what happens? What happens if our plan is going to take a year and we don't have a year in the books? What happens then? So I think we really do only have today, and I think that I think that one thing is figuring out what are those things I need to do to plug in to make the most of each day, and then what do I do with the fruit of that, And I don't think that it's huge stuff. I think it's small stuff, and then I think that adds up after a while.
Yeah. So I guess one question I would have as you're kind of talking here, because we are talking about if it's ultimately about a relationship with God and being able to plug in. Actually, two things I thought. One of them was actually this manifests more in my life in kind of my interactions with people. I think like there's one time in college I remember where one of our friends in the group who's kind of really an abrasive personality, kind of a jerk, and Like, not really a way to sugarcoat that, but he was. He also kind of he was kind of going through a rough time too, and there was one time where he was like, "Oh, I'm going to lunch. Does anyone want to go?" And no one wants to go with him. and I was like, "All right, what happens if?" I just had a moment where it's like, "All right, like if I invite God into the moment," and to me, plugging in is just kind of remembering, like, just trying to remember the experience of just being loved by God and trying to remember that and respond to that. And so, like, how do I respond to that right now? It's like, well, this guy exists because God wanted him, so I guess I should. I'll go. I'll go to lunch with him. And when I was at lunch with him, I'm like, "How's it going? Like, how's your week going?" And he's like, "What?" Like, people didn't really talk to him like that because he was kind of abrasive. But he's like, "How you doing? Like, how's it going?" Like, he's like, "Fine." And it was kind of weird. He was weird about it. But it changed the way I acted in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it actually, like, trying to remember God's love and then respond to it. It's like, how do I respond to it now?
Mm-hmm.
That's what kind of plugging in means for me.
And then I think the next step in prayer then comes with, so like now later in the day, you do some kind of an exam, whether it be a Ignatian exam or just you reflect on your day, and I think inevitably that lunch that evening is going to be something that you're going to remember. And then I think needs to come like some prayerful reflection on some of the whys. Why why is this guy so frustrated? What does he trigger in me that makes him so frustrating? Because lunch was nice. Like, lunch was fine. It was lunch.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't that bad of a guy.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he was a total jerk at lunch too. I don't know. But like,
No,
and so
right.
we started to pray more and more. Like, what is it about? What is God trying to do in me? Is always the follow-up question. That's where the interior life growth happens. You know what I mean? Why does this guy? And I think that
So maybe a plan is the wrong phrase. Maybe when I say, the today focus versus the long-term focus, it would maybe the long-term is for you. Would that be trying to recognize what God is calling you to? Is that more of a legitimate way of? Is there something more to that? Because obviously I can't really plan too much, like in a relationship. Oh, I want my relationship to be this in a year. It's like, well, what if you die tonight? But there's a difference between planning versus like trying to reflect and see where you're being called to. Is that?
Yeah,
is that a better way of putting it?
I think that similarly in the with the marriage thing, the analogy to marriage, there comes some point in that relationship where you start to think, the sort of commitment grows naturally. Maybe the first few dates, there's no guarantee that I'm not going to go on a couple dates with someone else too. Like,
yeah,
it's in the beginning, right? And then sort of there comes some point where you're like, no, I really have no interest in dates with someone else. I only want to go on dates with this person. And then it sort of moves into like, I want this person to be a part of my whole day and my whole life and my whole everyday. And so as that commitment level grows, like I think that in our heads and societally, like marriage is like a line in the sand.
It's a milestone.
It's a engagement and marriage is like these real defined moments culturally, but in reality,
everything was.
It's just that commitment continuing to deepen. You know what I mean? So similarly with God, as that relationship continues to deepen and that level of commitment with Him continues to deepen, similarly within there is the discernment process of, well, how is God calling me? What is God calling me to, right? That notion of vocation, marriage, marriage, a committed single life, or a vocation of priesthood or religious life, and then within that there's discernment. Is this the woman that God? Okay, God's calling me to marriage, but is it to this woman, or is it to that woman, or is it to this woman or to another woman? If it's a religious vocation that's discerned, is God calling me to the diocesan priesthood, so the religious priesthood in the religious life? If so, what religious community? So there's always sort of these deeper levels of discernment. At the end of the day, though, we're all called to give that total and complete gift of self, and it's expressed in one of these ways. So like discernment about the big long-term things like vocation, I think happens within there, just like it happens in any other experience of growth and commitment in terms of relationship to Him. Then I think these other pieces of discernment, like about jobs and schools and that type of a thing, I think that even those things really ultimately come down to about today. Is God calling me? It comes in pieces. That God reveals to us as we move through the process of growing in that relationship with Him.
Yeah. The more we're talking about this, the more the gym analogies are kind of coming back with a vengeance here, because something I learned is like once you kind of have the basics, like once you understand, like once you have a routine, it's like, all right, I'm gonna lift 5 days a week. I'm gonna do these kinds of days. I'm gonna do these kinds of lifts, and you kind of do that for a while, but then you start to realize how your body reacts. It's like, oh, I'm ready to push myself farther today. And it's not so much, the goals aren't so far out there, but maybe, it's like your goal is to lift more than you did last week, maybe. But, or maybe not. Maybe you're just feeling your body's sick of lifting. I've had moments where it's like my joints are just like, I want to lift today. Like, you should do cardio today. I've had moments where I actually, I haven't listened to my body, and it's like I lifted when my body was saying do cardio, and I just didn't have a good lifting day. It's kind of an art of like recognizing the state of your body, maybe your soul, right? And recognizing where you're at, and reacting to that. But there has to be something in the background of like, what am I reacting to? Like, and how am I reacting to the different situations? So like, in the spiritual life, you have, if you say, I want to tap in, or if I want to plug in this moment, or if, I feel like I feel like a restlessness in my soul, and I feel like God's calling me to something, it's like, you have to be the kind of person who recognizes restlessness as a call to, as a potential call to something. And then you have to try and figure out what that might be, right? And it's complicated, and it's complicated by all the details of who you are and your situation and your life and your emotions and everything else about you. And so like, this is a kind of, we're starting to close the loop here. It's kind of coming back to the whole complexity thing, where there's a simplicity in, look, it's about a relationship with God, and it's about plugging in and recognizing what God's calling you to. And I wonder if they're not mutually exclusive, but I'm kind of very in my head now. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this.
Well, and I think there's also I think that the church provides for us sort of guardrails for the whole thing. There's rules of discernment. There's the importance of having a spiritual director, is because the spiritual director is going to help. The spiritual director isn't going to tell you what's translate for you, but a spiritual director kind of serves as sort of to in that ministry of accompaniment, and to provide the church's what the guardrails are that the tradition of the church has passed on to us to sort of help with, sort of like the rules in your physics triangle,
Yeah.
to kind of help with those pieces, and I think that, so I think that's an important part of all of it. And I think there's some staples that for us as Catholics is, the sacraments are an essential part of this whole kit and caboodle,
Yeah.
The sacraments are without a doubt an important part. And, especially I go back all the time to the Eucharist because it's there where that gift of self is constantly given and renewed and refreshed and nourished, and the sacrament of reconciliation, because they go hand in hand, and where we're able to return to that life of grace and be rerooted in that life of grace, to be open to all of that, opens our hearts more and more to be more present in that moment to where God is calling us, you know.
Well, there's physics kind of lends us a little bit of vocabulary here, maybe to help us understand the simplicity and the complexity at the same time. There's kinematic expressions. Let's say you throw a ball and it has a trajectory. And if I want to know the trajectory of the ball, the exact precise motion, it's going to travel in this kind of curved line. And I could tell you tomorrow it's going to be here, or, not tomorrow, in 5 seconds it's going to be there, in 6 seconds it's going to be there. Right, that's kinematics. It's a very rigorous line, very detail specific plan of how something is going to move over time.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we can't do that. We don't have a kinematic trajectory. We don't have the kinematics. We don't have an exact trajectory of what my tomorrow is going to be, or if it's going to be. And so physics also captures this thing called dynamics, which is the art of looking at all the forces tugging at something and interacting with each other in this nonlinear way. And so as I move through my day, like there's so many things that are pulling at me in different directions. I got my job, I got my family, I got my friends, and I got my emotions, and I got everything else going on in my head, and I got my spiritual life, and I have all these things tugging at me and jostling for time and attention. And there's, we're trying to understand the dynamics and how they interrelate, if that makes sense. And the spiritual life is dynamic. It's not kinematic. It's not a trajectory that I can predict what tomorrow is going to be. It's a dynamic thing. And so dynamics captures that simplicity and complexity, where there are some underlying principles at the bottom, but you superimpose your situation into that. It's like, all right, I'm gonna use these kind of guiding principles, but I have to overlay them over my situation, and that's how I know how to navigate it.
And I think the unfortunate part is that, like, of all those things that we have going on in our lives, I think that our spiritual life is often the first thing to go. Is the prayer time. If we imagine our day, well, I have to work for 8 hours, and maybe I'm in school part time, and a significant other, and God forbid I have a hobby or something, and like prayer is what goes.
Yeah.
And the irony is that our spiritual lives really is the most important of all of those things, because eternity is an awful long time. And,
Yeah.
and that's the reality of it is that eternity is what we're made for. And so we have to make, I think that's step one, is making our spiritual lives as much of a priority as anything else, or more, and figuring out clever ways for that to happen.
We gotta trick ourselves into doing that sometimes.
Yeah, I think we do. And it's very easy for me like, to chart all this out and to have a, you know, but like, you know, we have a, you know, with the residents here, I'm often trying to help them find creative ways to work prayer into their, because they are busy people, you know, legitimately. And they're fairly new on this journey in the spiritual life, and so to find clever ways, and I think that we all have to do that. I think that
what's the difference in your mind between someone like who's new to this versus someone who's been doing it for a longer time? Like, what differences would you see? I'm just curious, but like, because maybe I don't want to revert back to the language of goals, but there is something to be said about a more mature spiritual life. Like, there's something more, you know, like there's something better about it, you know, or there's something.
I don't know that it's about better. I think that it's about. I don't think that it's about better or worse or better. I think it's just a journey, you know, and you know, I think that the spiritual. I think that in terms of your experience, your personal experience engaging in it, certainly takes on a new level of dynamic, you know. But I mean, who's to say? That's like saying to my parents, you know, is your relationship better today than it was on your wedding day? I mean, I've never asked them that, but I would imagine that they would say, well, I wouldn't say better, but it's different. You know, how do you take that wedding day where everything is just perfect and, you know, and say, well, no, it's better today when we're older and sick and worried about our kids and our grandkids and money and, you know, all these things that we weren't worried about 50-something years ago.
Well, if they've been together for a long time, though, they would hopefully be saying, well, we're not making the same mistakes we did back then.
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully the same can be said in the relationship with God, that we're not making the same. Hopefully, if we've been trudging through our spiritual life in an intentional way, like to really kind of grow deeper in it. Because there's certainly, I think, a difference between the person who just sort of, I pray, and I go to church, and, you know, and I'm a good person and all that, and the person who says, I want to grow in this relationship and I want to make this a priority. There is absolutely a difference between the two. And when you make that decision to take those steps to really kind of step off into this, I think that that's kind of a marked moment. And hopefully 20 years from now, you're not making the same mistakes as you were in the beginning. But that grows in terms of along with the relationship. You know what I mean? Like, much like with the dating thing, like in the beginning, so if you're in a relationship with someone, you're just getting to know someone, and you're just kind of starting a date, and I'm terrible with birthdays, and so like, I never remember people's birthdays. I can remember my own birthday. And that, you know, so you're within the first, you know, few months, and kind of you've gone out for dinner a few times with this person. You've also gone out for dinner a few times with that person, and like you're in a conversation with person A, and you kind of forget their birthday. Like, it's none of this is the end of the world, you know. But presumably a year later, you're still seeing this person. Going out on a date with someone else is no longer acceptable.
Yeah.
Not knowing her birthday is no longer acceptable. You know? Like...
Oh, it's not.
Not a year in. Because that means you've missed it. So, like, similarly, in the relationship with God, the further you move into this relationship, the more expectation there is, the more, I think, expectation on our part, for that matter, that, like, you know, like, there's going to be growth, of course. And so, 5 years into this real sort of intentional spiritual journey, are things better than they were before? They're different. Hopefully we're not making the same mistakes we were in the beginning.
Actually, now that
but
you're
if
saying
we live
that,
each day in today, then I'm exactly where. That means that today I'm exactly where God is calling me to be. And a year ago, I was where I needed to be a year ago.
Yeah, now that you're saying that, kind of what's coming to my mind is kind of in high school when I kind of first probably adopted the faith as my own. It's not just my parents' religion anymore. It's something for me. I think my experiences, like in adoration or holy hours, like I had more intense experiences back then, and they were great. But they kind of shook me out of like my normal way of living, and it really kicked me off. And actually, as time went on, they weren't as frequent or as intense. Like it just wasn't as emotionally vivid. Those experiences in holy hours, for example. But I wouldn't say it's worse. I'm kind of relating to what you're saying now, where it's like, oh, okay, it's different, but it's not worse. And I am not making the same mistakes, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that we also start to realize that, I don't want to say that sin changes, but there are things that, as this relationship grows, that we realize aren't acceptable. But they were acceptable before, but they're not anymore. It's like the birthday thing, like someone in a life of prayer might decide, I don't know, as they grow in the spiritual journey, they're going to go to Mass and confession more frequently. And they're going very regularly. I mean, beyond the obligations, right? And then it kind of peters down and you find yourself, you're back to kind of going, well, the church doesn't say we have to go to Mass more than once a week, nor does it say that we have to go to confession more than once a year, technically. But we feel a lack in it, because it's about a lack in participation in a relationship. Yeah. And it's about relationship. It's not about an obligation or about maybe 10 years ago, I'd be perfectly fine going to confession once a year and Mass every Sunday and Holy Day. But that's not where I am now. So yeah, I feel a lack when I'm not going a couple times a week to Mass and confession once a month.
Yeah.
Just to throw numbers out there,
Yeah.
They would say in the spiritual tradition of the church, we sort of understand that there are 3 phases of spiritual development: the purgative phase, the illuminative phase, and the unitive phase. The unitive phase is that which the mystics hit. Like 1% of the human race will ever total and complete union with God in this life. Teresa of Avila, ecstasy, that kind of thing. The experience, not the drug. But that first phase, the purgative phase, is where the vast majority of us, even some great saints, never move beyond that first phase, which is sort of a microcosm of the whole thing. And that first phase is marked initially by, some sense of spiritual awakening, and our concern is about sort of moral integration. And so the new convert to the faith, who is very much, no, I will not have sex with my significant other because it is wrong, because the church says it's wrong. And I won't do this because the church says it's wrong. I won't do that because the church says it's wrong. And everything's about right and wrong and black and white. Well, the opposite side of that is that life is a struggle. Because there are these black and white, my whole world is black and white. My faith life is built on morality and not on relationship. And I'm a broken human being who experiences temptation every day. So it's sort of like constant turmoil. At some point, we move from that black and white, regimented, sort of purely functional experience into mature faith. And that movement into mature faith is when it starts to go from being this, just going in worship kind of experience to a relationship experience. And then as we move through that, that's when we find like kind of the mini version of the Dark Knight, where we have those experiences of desolation, but it doesn't break us because this relationship is now deeper than that.
Yeah.
This relationship is deeper than just emotion. So I can experience desolation in prayer, and it doesn't screw up my whole spiritual life because I know that he's there nonetheless. And I realize that if I'm experiencing desolation in prayer, there's a reason. And that maybe God's trying to work with me through this desolation. Maybe God's trying to communicate something to me. Maybe it isn't so much a matter of desolation, or maybe it's a matter of more I'm being lazy in prayer.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm not telling him something. That's what I usually tell people. My prayer life is dry. Well, what are you not telling him? Because prayer is never really dry. We always have something we can tell him.
Yeah.
So sort of like, there's definitely, but it's not so much a matter of like rungs on a ladder, and we're trying to climb this ladder. It's more about that this is how we sort of can mark the benchmarks along the way, And I don't think they're goals we work towards. I think that they're just places we arrive at.
Yeah. The church is kind of reflecting on just its own people.
And as we kind of move through that experience of development, the more prayer increases, the more anxiety kind of decreases, and that's when we start to see a change.
Anxiety not meaning desolation necessarily.
No, just the anxiety and fear-driven prayer, Lord, help Aunt Susie, help this one, help that one, help me. Because I think that initially in the life of prayer, we pray for stuff and people and ourselves. I need this, I need that, I need this, I need that. And then we think we've become saints when we realize that we need to pray for others. And so that's when we hear the people say, I rarely pray for myself. I'm always praying for others. Wonderful. But that's still anxiety and fear-driven prayer, right? Well, but when you move into this sort of relationship idea, I think it's less about, it's just different. People tell me all the time, "Can you please pray for me?" Yeah, sure. I said to other people, I'm praying for you. That prayer though is just, it's different. It's not, Lord, please help Joe because he's looking for a job. It's more about, Lord, inspire Joe to open his heart to see the job you have in mind for him. It's a little bit different. And it's also less about
particular outcomes in your...
And it's less about me really verbalizing things to him. It's more about like, Lord, I'm putting Joe in your hands. He knows Joe's got no job. He knows the job he has in mind for Joe. I don't need to tell him those things. We tell things to God in prayer for ourselves because that helps us become vulnerable before him by sharing things with him. Because that's what we do in relationships. We share things with the people we trust, right? So this whole sort of thing takes on more and more dynamic life as the relationship deepens, as we move along that track and away from that sort of just worship experience.
Well, maybe the closest thing to a trajectory is if everything is, I can't say if everything's going well. I can't say if we're following all the rules. Like, that's not true. But there's something about the intentional pursuit of a relationship with God, and it's moving more and more towards unity with him. And so maybe that's kind of, maybe to your point about how your prayer is going to change, where initially you might be having more simple prayers about kind of specific outcomes of any dice roll in your day, any coin flip, but maybe as you move on, it's less about the result of the coin flip, and it's more about seeing God's will for you on whatever side it lands on. And then I don't know what comes after that. I'm not that holy yet, but
and I think that we also within this, all the rest of our Catholic faith takes on a whole new view when you embrace the notion of prayer as relationship and moving towards that total intimacy and union with Him. Things like the Mass takes on a whole new meaning, adoration. The devotion of the saints takes on a whole new meaning. Our Marian devotion takes on an incredible new meaning when we really kind of step deeper and deeper and deeper into this.
Yeah.
And so it's not like as St. Thomas would say, it's not either or, it's both and they feed one another in a beautiful way.
The hardest thing for me, something you were saying, I don't know, 10 minutes ago, triggered this thought. The hardest thing for me actually is when I have to reform my concept of God, where if I realize I need to change something in my life, I could do that. That's fine. I do that all the time. Like, I'm not perfect, and I realize that. But if I have this idea that God is perfect, but then I've been thinking about God the wrong way. That's a much bigger thing for me. So, like, for the example that comes to mind is, especially when I was younger, before I experienced a lot, good or bad, I think I had a more, I don't want to say naive vision of God as this just maybe like a grandpa, like maybe kind of borrowing C.S. Lewis's language, God's a grandpa, where he kind of loves you, and he kind of gives nice things to you, and just don't be a bad boy, and pat you on the head kind of deal. But it's like, no, he'll let your ass get kicked. And when that started happening to me as I got a little older, it's like, once I started getting what's the phrase? There was a phrase I heard. It's the relationship with the unforgiving, where if you put yourself out there in in a career or in a sport, or when you're rock climbing, it's like there's no judge. Like, the rock is the judge. Like that, the relationship with the unforgiving. When you start getting your ass kicked, just if you're putting yourself out there, if you're dating and you get rejected, or
and He gives us free will. So, it's sort of like the prodigal son. The kid goes to the father, says, give me my share of the inheritance, and he gives it to him. There's no argument at all. Here you go. He lets the son go. He doesn't fight with him. He doesn't debate with him. He doesn't. And we have free will, so like God's always going to let us. Yeah, and He lets us get tossed around in the waves a little bit, and He, because that's sort of all part of it.
Yeah, but I think the first times I really experienced the kind of tough love side of God, I had to totally reform my concept of God, and that was a much bigger deal than reforming my concept of me. That's kind of the hardest thing, because if I'm holding up God, putting God on a pedestal, but if I'm kind of looking up to this, if I have this image of Him as the perfect person, but then I realized that image was wrong, it's like, I'm off the mark, and I gotta rethink this whole thing, where it's like, God would let me go through these things, and it's like, it really sets you back. And that was like, talking about the spiritual life, like that was something that took years to just digest.
Yeah, well, I mean, He has to let us go through these things, because these things are usually of our own making, and we have free will, and He's not going to take that away. And then there's these other pieces of, there's suffering we go through in life that are not of our own making, that we just sort of inherit, which, as people of faith, we understand it shares ways for us to share in His cross, and just the reality of living in the world, in a broken world, you know? And, you know, I think that the example of Mary shows us, it's the go-to, like every church document ends with something about Mary, you know, not the movie, but it's that, but, you know, because she really does encapsulate, she really and truly encapsulates sort of all of this stuff. And you think about, here's this girl who is presented with this notion by an angel of, you know, and when she says, like I referenced earlier, when she says yes, she doesn't just say yes to being pregnant. John Paul II in Redemptoris Mater, he says, in paragraph 13, he says that her yes is decisive, in that she says yes to the whole enchilada. Because she says, I'm this handmaid of the Lord, be done to me as you say. She, in that moment, says yes to whatever God is asking of her for the rest of her days. And boy, does he put her through a ringer, right? And she remains faithful all the way through it all, at the foot of the cross, and I think it's fascinating that, I remember we had a big debate about this in Mariology class, about the Gospels don't show or tell us about him appearing to her after the resurrection. And my stance was that maybe he didn't, because he didn't need to, you know? Because I think that she was such a her faith and her relationship with him was so perfect that she knew he'd risen. And that was all that mattered. She knew. She didn't need the proof that Peter needed and that Thomas needed and that everyone else needed. You know? Now, the romantic side of me likes to think that he appeared to her, that they had, you know, some beautiful some beautiful mother-son moment or whatever, but I think that there's a real purpose for it not being made known to us, whether he appeared to her or not, because the lesson is that she wouldn't have needed him to, you know, because that relationship was so, and she got knocked around by the storm of life in a big way, you know, through that whole thing, from the moment she said yes.
Yeah,
in ways we don't even think about.
There was a phrase that we talked about in one of our Crossroads meetings a week or two ago, and it was filial boldness. And it's like, as a member of the family, you can be bold in your status as, you know, child of God, or in the case of Mary, you know, mother of God. And the boldness may be a sort of presumptuousness almost of, yeah, he rose from the dead. Like, yeah. And there was another saint, I forget who, it might have been Therese or Faustina, I forget, someone, and it was when they're praying for something, it's like they know how to pray and they don't ask for something. They're like, thank you because you're going to give this to me. Like there's a boldness in the spiritual life of like, I know how to ask for things. I know God's going to give me what I need spiritually, so I'm just thanking him for that. Like I'm not asking for things anymore. You know, maybe that's not a guideline for how people should pray, but that's just illustrating kind of where they're at.
I think that for me, like asking God for things is like, you know, he knows. I think that for big, like right now, I mean, you know, I'm in sort of a transition myself in ministry, and you know, it's something that I pray about, but he knows. So like, if I'm going to go and sit in front of the Eucharist for an hour, I'm not spending even a minute of that rambling about how much I want this, you know, process to. He knows. I'm going to use that time to fall more deeply in love with him and to spend time with the one that I've given my life to. It's sort of like, if I'm mad about something, or if I'm, you know, if I'm going to go and sit with my wife for an hour and we're going to have dinner, I don't want to waste that whole time bitching about my day, or, you know what I mean? I want to spend that time enjoying them. And when I do really sort of talk about certain things with God, whether it be, you know, something I'm upset about or something I'm worried about or something it's from a perspective where I realize that it's not to communicate information. It's to create openness between he and I, so that I could be open to what he has to give to me, which about any topic, not necessarily about that topic. Does that make sense? Like if I'm really angry at someone and I go, you know, and I take a little time at the beginning to share with the Lord that I'm angry and why I'm angry, that helps me be open to whatever other graces are going to come during that holy hour. So I definitely think that like prayer, it changes, it becomes sort of more dynamic and a little bit more.
That's how you would help. That's how you would plug in.
Yeah, you know, and I think that, and all these other things are important, you know, the rosaries and the liturgy of the hours and all those things, but like, it's really about that time we spend with him in quiet, you know. I think that, especially because, you know, we go to adoration, and I remember when I was in the seminary, you know, I'd go do my holy hour, and I would bring just like a pile of books, you know, so I had something to do for the whole hour. So I'd read from this book, and I would sort of meditate for a little bit about it, and then I'd read from this book and think about that, and then I'd get the journal, write in the journal, and then I'd do the rosary, or I was always doing things. And I think that in hindsight, it's sort of like, if I'm going to spend an hour with my best friend, I'm not going to bring a book to tell me what to say to him. You know? I'm going to enjoy that time with my best friend. And there are times, you know, I remember my aunt and uncle had been married for, 1,000 years. I remember saying once, gee, Uncle Gus, you know, did you and Aunt Josephine have a fight? You were awfully quiet today. And he said, David, after 50-something years, we have nothing left to say. And I kind of like laughed at the time, and now I realize how beautiful that is. This married couple, for all these years, that can sit in silence and be perfectly happy, because that time in silence with this person means more than empty noise with anyone else. You know? And I think sometimes in our prayer life, we fill it with noise. You know, like that person who's just a nervous person, and so they make empty conversation so that there's noise, because they feel uncomfortable in the silence. You know, I think we do that with God sometimes. And so I think there's some marks or some ways to kind of see that, yeah, it's moving along. As you see that change in prayer, you see maybe some more quiet. You see less books. You know, less, you know, the beads take on a whole new view, you know. In the seminary, I remember to do the rosary, I would use one of those books, the scriptural rosary books, you know. So I had a little sentence to meditate on for each bead. I didn't really know no one ever really told me what you're supposed to be doing interiorly when you do the rosary. Yeah, I knew the Our Father and 10 Hail Marys, but no one ever really told me the deeper part of it, you know? Yeah. And then, but, like, I think that when it becomes about relationship, now the rosary becomes the mantra in the background, where we invite her into our prayer life. And it becomes, I think after a while, even not necessarily about set mysteries anymore, but it's a way of inviting her into our prayer, you know? And I think our devotion to the saints, do we ever think to invite the saints that we have devotions to, invite them to pray the rosary with us? And then the rosary serves as sort of a mantra in the background for us to move into that deeper sort of contemplation. So now we have time spent with Jesus at an intimate level to to Jesus through Mary. With the saints, we have devotions to praying with us. What a power hour that is, right? But we're not thinking that way when we're back at step one, right? Just like punching the time clock on Sunday and trying to not break the commandments and banging out the beads once a week, you know? But when it becomes about relationship, then we can look at it sort of through this other lens.
Yeah. So to kind of start closing the loop on this a little bit, I think I really like to, my physics brain is thinking about the upside down pyramid still. And I think when it comes to, let's say, well, maybe to just briefly do the physics analogy one more time, where like, let's say you have a pipe, you know, you're an engineer, you got a pipe and you got water going through it. It's like, I want to understand this. And kind of at the bottom of your pyramid, you got kind of Newton's laws of motion, just forces and masses and how they accelerate and what make, you know, what's pushing them around. But then it's like, well, I'm talking about fluids specifically, so then I have principles for fluid mechanics, like Navier-Stokes equations. But then it's like, well, I'm dealing with pipes, and maybe I'm going to treat this as an inviscid fluid. So I got another shortcut for my pipes, which is up here. I got maybe Bernoulli's equations. And then above that, I got my pipe, right? Here's my situation. There's kind of, and I think the Catholics, you know, and we have our pipe and we have the bottom of the pyramid, which is a relationship with God. But there's stuff in the middle, which is like, you know, I'm dealing with fluids and I'm dealing with pipes. And so like, what am I dealing with? And I think when it comes to the interior life, it's almost like kind of what are we dealing with? I think what's it about? It's about, yeah, at the bottom is it's a relationship with God, but what's going on in the middle? It seems like we're talking about trying to understand where God is calling us and trying to tap into kind of the presence of God and trying to invite God into the day. And that seems like, again, it's very generic, but that's kind of the point. These are kind of principles under kind of what's going on with the interior life at a high level. And then we could talk about tips and tricks all day. So it's like when you're praying the rosary, it's like, I can't focus. What's a trick? Mm-hmm. Or, you know, if I'm, you know, whatever my situation is, you know, what are tricks for, I don't want to say tricks, but, you know, I mean, like tips and, you know, some tribal knowledge when it comes to discerning my vocation, you know. But really at the heart of all that is how do I connect with God, and how do I try and understand where I am in relation to Him, and how He's calling me to deepen that, and you know, and noticing how that plays out over time. You know, we can reflect and on ourselves, and we can kind of look at the church for examples to understand how it plays out for other people and how it's playing out for us in our life. I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, and I think, I think it's true. And I think I always start people in spiritual direction by looking at their relationships in life. Because, so a little kid learns how to walk, and they're like wobbly, right? They take every step they gotta kind of think about, and it's calculated, and they fall, and that's when they realize they gotta, you know, and eventually, like, we don't walk like that our whole lives. Eventually walking becomes, we don't even think about it. Like, when we get up out of these chairs and walk out of this room, we're not going to be like, okay, feet, now it's time to move. It's autopilot. And that autopilot is set up during those first days of walking, right? Our autopilot is set up from when we're tiny. And our autopilot includes so many things: eating, breathing, walking. It includes things like relationships, because our first relationship is with our parents. Whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, these are the people who wipe your butts. So you have a relationship with them, whether it's good or bad, right? And then all of our other relationships sort of grow from that one, if you think about it. Like, by comparing and contrasting at a subconscious level, relationships sort of grow from that one. And then somewhere along the way, we have those relationships that we, the first person we really trust with just everything. The first person that we are vulnerable with. And our autopilot for relationships continues to get tweaked based on what happens there, right? And that impacts things like trust and willingness, type of thing. Relationship with God is another relationship in our lives. And I think that, first of all, if you consider your relationship with your parents and whoever that first person was that you trusted, that you would trust with just absolutely anything, maybe it was your parents, but if it was someone else, I would imagine that your image of God at the beginning of your spiritual journey looks something like those relationships. And it's useful to take note of our interactions with others, because that speaks to us about how we engage in relationship. And then we should always ask ourselves the question, how does this impact my relationship with God? I've come to notice in life that I become, you just mentioned connection. It is about connection. And I've come to notice that when I feel a lack of connectedness, like, life is about connectedness, communion, right? And so something that I've tried to sort of learn from via the exam in my prayer life is what are sort of the themes and trends? What brings about lacking of connectedness in my relationships, so that I can make sure that's not an issue in my relationship with God, how often in life our lack of connectedness with another person is because we think we're not being heard. That's our ego being bruised. That's why there's a lack of connection, right? How often does our bruised ego mess up things in this relationship with God? That type of thing, And so, and all of these discoveries is God's movement in our lives so that we can grow deeper in that relationship. So yeah, I think that we do. We have to check in. We have to check in throughout the day. We have to invest that time just spent with the one we love, being Him, and allowing Him to lead us on this journey, And I think it's less about my plan for how this relationship's going to grow and more about dedicating each day to being open to where He wants to take me.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, I think that's a podcast.
Yeah, it is.
I'm getting a little fried now, but yeah.